I've noticed something quite strange, that I remember more when I write with a pen than when I type something. You might have noticed that yourself. Now, it turns out there's some very important scientific reasons for that, and understanding this can help us to learn things more deeply and a wee bit faster. Now, it turns out that most people can type a little bit faster than they can write. So the first thing that happens when you physically write with a pen is by doing something more slowly. In a sense, it slows your brain down. And as you're literally doing things a wee bit slower, it helps you to process the stuff a little bit better. It helps the brain just to absorb the content. But that's only part of it, because there's something even deeper going on. Over hundreds of thousands of years, our ancient ancestors would express their thinking by taking, whether it was a stone and scratching into the wall of a cave, or in the modern day whether it was a quill or a pen. But consistent through all of that time has been the physical movement of forming letters, words, or images in paintings. That physical act of movement, moving the hand itself, became connected with the meaning of the thing that we were forming, whether we were forming words or making pictures, i.e. paintings on old cave walls thousands and thousands of years ago. The brain learned to associate the physical movement with the meaning itself. So when we physically write things down with a pen, we're actually tapping into ancient structures in the brain, ancient ways that the brain works to understand things better, because the physical act itself of writing, if we actually take our time to physically write and form the letters, it helps the brain to process the meaning that wee bit better, because we're using systems of the brain that it evolved to actually use. Another thing that writing does is it also helps to clear mental space. Now, your brain is really good at thinking, but it's not so good at holding lots of thoughts at the same time. You must have noticed this. The more thoughts you've got, it ends up creating mental noise. But the act of writing something down helps to take those thoughts, and it's almost like you're threading them all together. And the act of writing down acts a wee bit like a mental release valve, and as you release like that, it helps you actually to create clarity, and you might have noticed this yourself, the act of writing it down, you start to make connections and join the dots, and it's not uncommon to have moments of insight that you hadn't thought before, because all the stuff in your head is one thing, but when you physically put it down on paper, you go, oh my goodness. I remember when I was writing my first book, having this sort of several times eureka moments, because when I wrote my very first book, I actually physically freehand wrote the chapters, and I remember having these thoughts that I thought were clear. But as I wrote them down the paper, they became even clearer. The act of writing actually clarified my thinking, in part for the reasons that I've just explained. But another thing that writing does, or let me rephrase it, another thing that writing reveals is what you don't fully understand yet. I mean, have you ever found yourself explaining something to someone, and then half the way through, you realise in your own mind that you don't actually understand it yourself as well as you thought you did. But what writing does, through the reasons that I've just explained, writing helps you to get a clearer understanding of it, because what you're taking is ideas and you're forming them into sentences and then into structure, so you're better understanding them yourself. I find myself inspired by the words of the great physicist Richard Feynman, who once said something like, if you can't explain something simply, then you probably don't understand it well enough yourself. And it was that or thereabouts. He said something like that, and I've taken that to heart over the years, because if I'm, say, writing a book chapter, or maybe I'm trying to understand a piece of science that's quite new to me, or that I don't fully understand the complexities as well as I'd like to, I set myself the goal of trying to explain that to someone with no background in science, or sometimes I even set myself the goal, could I explain this seemingly complex subject? Could I explain this to a child, maybe a child around the age of 9 or 10-year-old? And that's a good goal to set, because when you immediately start out doing it, you suddenly realise when you're writing it down that if you try to speak it out loud initially, that I don't understand this well enough, because it's showing me gaps in my thinking, my understanding, and in my reasoning. But the act of writing it down helps, for the reasons I've explained, helps to clarify a lot of that. In fact, also, what I find helpful is I physically get up, and even though this isn't writing, it's like an extension of it, and because it hacks into similar brain networks, I actually get up and I walk around. But this is how I sometimes write book chapters, or even how, partly as well as freehand writing, how I also prepare for talks. If I'm giving a talk on a subject that I'm only learning for the first time myself, or I haven't spoken on before, is I literally get up and I walk around my office pretending that I'm speaking to people, like, as I say, a child, or people who have absolutely no background in the subject that I'm talking about. And I find myself, the first time I do it, my thinking's all over the place, and what I thought I knew, I don't know well enough, because there's loads of gaps in my thinking and my understanding. But I keep doing it, and then again and again and again, and all of a sudden 20 minutes of rambling comes down to about 3 or 4 minutes of some really precise understanding of something. And the reason why this works as an extension of writing is, not only did our ancient ancestors learn to communicate by forming the physical movement of forming letters and images, and that becoming connected to meaning, we also learned by talking around the campfire and communicating verbally with each other. So it's like talking out loud is also an extension of writing. And I'm only saying this because I think we're losing this art these days, because most of us are now typing everything, or we're tapping something onto a smartphone. And I thought it might be quite useful to know that your brain is actually more wired for, or better able to understand things, if you physically slow things down. And I know in this fast-paced world, you don't really want to slow things down, because if I can type it out, then I'll understand it a bit better. But if the goal is to richly understand something, then if you slow it down, you'll actually, by writing, physically writing, you might actually, probably will actually get to the goal of a richer understanding faster. Even though the process itself is a lengthier process, but the end result, you get there faster, I would say, even with a deeper understanding. That's been my personal experience. So anyway, have a wee go yourself. Think of, see if you can identify something over the next week or so, something that you're trying to learn, or something you're trying to better understand. Maybe you're studying, maybe maybe you're at school, maybe you're at college, university, or maybe it's something to do with work. Something that you're trying to understand, and usually maybe what you do is just keep reading the thing. You read it a few times, or you might type things out. Try instead, take a pen and a bit of paper and just write it down and just see what happens. Notice if you start to understand it a little bit better, a little bit more deeply, and just observe yourself. Observe the slower process, how that actually works better for gaining a deeper understanding of the subject. So have a wee go and see how you get on.